He has made frequent appearances on Bloomberg Radio and in Investors Business Daily and numerous other national publications. His best-selling book, The Power of Zero, has sold over, and you can correct me, is it over 350,000 copies now? Well, Dave McKnight, welcome to the Charlie Little Business Podcast. Thanks for taking the time and for joining me today. As a little update, yeah, you bet. I just got back from serving my mission in Puerto Rico. That's how I know you, obviously. But that was awesome. So I did that for 2 years. I started this business podcast before and did like 9 or 10 episodes, but it's exciting to continue. Also, I'll try to do like one a week, but kind of the audience is we're just trying to help young people, kind of my age in college, who are thinking about what to do with their future, their career, to figure out what they want to do. And if they have a business, how they can improve it and just kind of get the most out of life. So I'm super excited to have you here. Yeah, and another update, I'm here at BYU. So I'll be doing that during the year, but during the summers, I'm selling solar. So I'll take kind of a break during the summer. And if there's any young people out there that want to have some experience or with sales, let me know. But this is exciting. So we've got Dave McKnight, the author of The Power of Zero. I've got 2 copies because one's for me, one's to give away. So just send me a DM and I'll give you the copy so you can read. I'll read the little intro here so they can kind of know who you are, and then you can kind of say hi. But so it says here, David McKnight graduated from Brigham Young University with honors in 1997. Over the past 20 years, David has helped put thousands of Americans on the road to the 0% tax bracket. He has made frequent appearances on Bloomberg Radio and in Investors Business Daily and numerous other national publications. His best-selling book, The Power of Zero, has sold over, and you can correct me, is it over 350,000 copies now?
Yep.
He mentors hundreds of financial advisors, president of David McKnight & Company. And these advisors specialize in the Power of Zero retirement approach. He currently resides in Puerto Rico with his wife, Felice, and their 7 children. I love your family. But yeah, thanks for jumping on.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And it's sort of a little surreal to have you in my house as a missionary and then to be doing this podcast with you. So kind of cool.
Yeah, it's cool for me too. So as an overview, so I've read it and I watched the documentary. I especially enjoyed the movie. That was fun. So it sounds like Doug Orchard kind of put it together as a little film, which you can watch on YouTube, Amazon Prime, or Apple TV. But basically with The Power of Zero, and you'll be better, you explain this to people every day for years, so you're better at explaining it than me. But basically the goal is to get into the 0% tax bracket. So you have your income, your wealth, and you've got 3 buckets. Basically the taxable bucket, so like stocks, bonds, mutual funds, the tax deferred bucket, 401ks, IRAs. And then the tax-free bucket is kind of the ideal, because the whole thing is that there's a freight train coming with taxes going up. So you want Roth IRAs and what is it? Life insurance, retirement plan, LIRP. So cool. So you've explained this to me once, but for everyone listening, where did you come up with this idea and the buckets, and how did you go from writing, speaking to the movie and everything?
Yeah, so I got into this industry right out of BYU. It's the only thing I've ever done. So 1997, I got into this industry and I developed a presentation that involved 3 buckets, taxable, tax deferred, tax free. And I would sit across the table from clients. And I'd say, look, you've got all your money in taxable and tax deferred. And, in a rising tax rate environment, that's not the best place to have it, because you're sort of in this business partnership with the IRS. And every year they get to vote on what percentage of your profits they get to keep. Not an awesome business partnership to be in. So that initial presentation only took 5 minutes. I draw an arrow from taxable and tax deferred to tax free. I say, this is the plan. You want to get money from here to there. Well, as time wore on, something would fall out of my mouth in just the right way. And I'm like, oh, that was sort of fortuitous. And it seemed to resonate well with my clients and prospects. So I think I'll use that in the next presentation. And I sort of built that presentation out in that fashion over the course of the next, 10 to 15 years. And I remember I was at and I soon got to the point where people were asking me to give that presentation all across the country. And I remember I was sitting in a presentation given by my good friend, Tom Hegna, who is also in our industry. He's a leader. He does a lot of speaking. He talks about guaranteed income for life. And he said, he gave this great presentation, one of the greatest presentations I've ever seen. And he goes, by the way, if you wish someone had been here to see this presentation, but they weren't able to be here, I actually have written a book, which is basically the book version of the presentation you just saw. And you can get it in the back of the room for, $19.99 or whatever. So it sort of hit me like a bolt out of the blue that is a missing piece. I've got this great presentation that people are asking me to give all across the country, but that reach is only going to extend so far. And so I decided to commit that presentation to book format. I literally wrote the book in about 3 days. I sort of regurgitated the presentation onto the paper and, sort of built it out a little bit and expanded on a few ideas. And I threw it out on Amazon and crossed my fingers and hope for the best. And, here we are. That's 8 years later. And like you said, it's sold 350,000 copies, which of course has exceeded all my wildest expectations, and sort of fomented this mini revolution, if you will, where people are now much more aware that tax rates down the road are likely to be dramatically higher than they are today. And it sort of turns convention on its ear. Most people are used to just saving blindly in IRAs and 401ks. Well, if tax rates are going up, that's no longer the best bucket within which to be saving your retirement. So we're just trying to get the word out in a lot of different formats, whether it's my YouTube channel or social media or books or movies, that there is a freight train bearing down in America, and it's coming in the form of higher taxes.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, and I like at the beginning of the book, chapter 1 talks about David Walker, and he's based on the current fiscal path, future tax rates will have to double or our country could go bankrupt. Why? And there's a 4-letter word. They're like, what is it? Debt, wars, kids, and it's math. So I'm sure it's as you read this, you hear about it's super logical, this like system and the 0% tax bracket and getting there. But when was the first time it was on your radar? Like, did someone tell you about this, or you just logically you're like, oh, this makes the most financial sense?
I'd always known that the federal government has promised way more than it can afford to deliver in the form of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and as the debt grows, the debt burden, the cost of servicing the interest on the national debt grows right along with it. So I always knew that was an issue, but I think the person that really put this squarely on my radar was David Walker. Back in 2008 or 2009, he appeared on 60 Minutes, and he was in the midst of what he called this fiscal wake-up tour, and he was just charging across the country. 60 Minutes says it was like an Old Testament prophet raising the warning cry to people about the fiscal trajectory of our country and how that would probably precipitate much higher tax rates in the future. So he helped to coalesce a lot of my thoughts on this. And since then, he and I have become friends. He's appeared on my podcast. Of course, he figured prominently in the documentary. And he's no longer the comptroller general. He resigned in 2008, I believe, just for the express purpose so he could start crisscrossing the country, getting the message out about the fiscal instability of our country. But he really is, I think, the person who really helped me understand that there was a major problem afoot, and that every year that goes by where we fail to address it as a country means that the fix on the back end is going to be that much more aggressive and draconian. It's going to be, it means that tax rates down the road are per force going to be much higher than they are today.
I love this quote. So Admiral Mike Mullen says our greatest national security threat was the national debt, because before you have to provide for the common defense, you have to pay for it, which I hadn't thought of before, but makes a lot of sense. Since there's a lot of young people listening, Dave, why do you think 20-year-olds should pay attention to this? Most 20-year-olds probably aren't saving for retirement, or maybe it's not on their radar. But obviously, as younger people, we're probably going to get most of the raised taxes, like not going to see Social Security at all. So why would that be something they should pay attention to?
Yeah, so I say that the farther you are from retirement, the younger you are as a general rule, the higher your tax rate will be when you do retire. And that's just because if you look at the fiscal trajectory of our country, if you look at the trajectory of the debt, it just rises precipitously. I saw a recent graph of it where it sort of hums along like this, and it's not so much the debt, it's the debt to GDP, it's the the debt relative to our gross domestic product. So the debt to GDP was sort of hovering, in a pretty fiscally sane way. Now we're getting to the point where I think the most recent number was we're at 124%. If you go to usdebtclock.org, you can go down, there's an upper left-hand section, and you go to the lower right-hand corner of the upper left-hand section. It tells you what our debt to GDP is, and it's at 124%. But it's actually much worse than that, okay? Because basically the way we keep track of our debt is different than the way the rest of the world keeps track of their debt. The rest of the world keeps track of their debt in the following way. It's not just what we owe, it's what we owe over the next 75 years for things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid that we can't afford to pay. So that's what we call a fiscal gap. And there's a guy named Dr. Larry Kotlikoff out of Boston University who's the foremost expert on fiscal gap accounting. And he basically says the difference between what we have promised and what we can actually afford to pay is $200. So that's a lot more than 30 trillion. And the rest of the country keeps track of their debt in that way, but we don't. And why don't we? Because politicians have voted not to, because it doesn't make them look like good stewards of our, of our money, right? So why should young people care about this? Because we're marching into a future where all of these programs are going to start costing more and more and more. The national debt's not going to keep growing by just $1 trillion. It's going to start growing by 2 trillion and then 3 trillion and then 4 trillion. Because we've got to be able to pay for things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the national debt. All of these things we are required to pay for by law. The only way you can change Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid is if you get an act of Congress. So absent an act of Congress, we have to find the money to pay for it. And how we've been finding the money to pay for it is simply by borrowing it, which is not the best way to do it, because what's going to happen is we're constitutionally required, as David Walker says, to pay the interest on that national debt. We can't default on it. So where are we going to get the money to pay for all that interest when that interest consumes the entire federal budget? So that's the issue. We're going to get to a point where all of the money coming in from just normal tax rates is going to go to service all that debt. And then we're not going to be able to pay for basic services like welfare and national parks and the Air and Space Museum and food stamps and all this stuff. We're going to have to raise taxes. And it's not an opinion, it's a fiscal reality. And so when you look, if you're 20 years old right now and you want to retire at 60, look at that debt chart 40 years from now and see what the debt to GDP ratio is going to be at that time and what tax rates would have to be able to just pay the interest on all that debt. And hey, you have all your money in a 401k and IRA, you're only going to be able to keep half of that money at best. And that's why I tell people that are young, pay the tax now, do it at historically low tax rates. You're at probably a low tax bracket, the lowest you're going to be in your lifetime. Pay the tax at today's historically low tax rates at a low tax bracket, so that by the time you have to take those dollars out somewhere down the road, you've done all the heavy lifting. You can then take that money out tax-free.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And obviously the main one's Roth IRA. Life insurance was not on my radar at all, but you talk about life insurance retirement plans. Logistically, how does that work? Is that something young people should think about too? Or that's kind of more of a, when you have kids and it's actually something.
Yeah, it's not my favorite tool for young people that are single. I typically advocate for an approach that calls for multiple streams of tax-free income, and let's sort of list them out here. Certainly the Roth IRA is going to be huge for young people. The Roth 401k I love because you get a match, you get free money. The Roth IRA is also nice because you have liquidity. Whatever you put in, you can take out. I'm not saying make it your emergency fund, but that is a nice component of it. You've got a Roth conversion, which really shouldn't come into play until further down the road. You have the LIRP, which is nice because it's sort of like a Roth IRA, but it's got a death benefit component that can also double as long-term care. Now, young people don't worry about long-term care, but there will come a time in your life where you see your parents going through long-term care. And sooner or later, you're going to ask yourself the question, how am I going to handle long-term care? Am I going to be a burden on my own children when I can no longer feed myself, bathe myself, transfer myself, what have you? And so the LIRP can be very useful because it can allow you to get your death benefit in advance of your death for the purpose of paying for long-term care. But most people, when they use the LIRP when they're young, it's as a complement to the Roth IRA and the Roth 401k.
And what is a Roth conversion? How does that work?
Yeah, so let's say you put money into your 401k and you work with a company for, say, 20 years, and then you want to switch companies. A lot of times what you'll do is you'll roll that 401k into an IRA. Well, you don't really change the taxation of that money, but you change the name of the account and some of the rules that go along with it. So if you have money in an IRA, you still haven't paid the taxes on it. You're going to probably pay the tax on it somewhere down the road when either you decide to take the money out or the IRS forces you to take that out at age 72. And so what a lot of people do is they sort of make the calculus. They say, am I better off to pay that tax today at historically low tax rates, or am I better off to pay the tax on that money way down the road when tax rates are likely to be much, much higher than they are today? So a lot of people say, well, a bird in the hand is better than two in a bush. I'd much rather pay the tax today than somewhere down the road. So that's probably not something that a 20-year-old would really need to worry about now, but certainly 30 years from now, it might be a big deal.
The other thing I've noticed that you take advantage of is moving to Puerto Rico, which obviously for Act 60, which is, maybe you could explain it better, but lower taxes, and you can kind of avoid capital gain tax. You've done that earlier than most people. So what are some benefits there, and where does that kind of fall under the buckets? I mean, it's just lower taxes, but what does that kind of look like?
Yeah, so the way it works in Puerto Rico is if you have a qualified business and you get approved by the Puerto Rican government, who has an agreement with the IRS in the United States, not like they're doing it on the sly. They basically say that if you become a Puerto Rican citizen, we will waive your federal tax, we will waive your state tax, and we will charge you a flat 4% tax on all of your income, okay? And then we will charge you 0 on all capital gains. So what does that mean? That means that, you know, if I were in the States right now and I met sort of the income thresholds, I could put money into a Roth IRA to the tune of $6,000 a year. Well, that doesn't really, that's sort of like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. Putting 6,000 away for me at my stage of the game is not really useful. Well, here in Puerto Rico, let's say, you know, you could save, I don't know, just pick a number out of the air. You could save $1 million a year. As long as you stay in Puerto Rico, that money all grows tax-free. It's like I made $1 million contribution to a Roth IRA. And so long as I'm in Puerto Rico, that money continues to grow tax-free. So you can start to get a sense of the benefit that you can experience by moving here. Now, when you're here, you put up with the potholes and the stoplights that don't always work, and the rolling blackouts and the parrots that sometimes squawk a little too loudly, and from your neighbors. But that's all part of the deal. I'm not criticizing any of that, but there's a trade-off. You lose a little bit of infrastructure in exchange for some tax savings. So it's nice to be able to build a little nest egg while you're here. But I think that most people that come here don't plan on staying for 20 years. They sort of come in and they stay for a while, they build a nest egg, and then they move on.
I think the nice thing is at the end of the day, you live in Puerto Rico. You kind of live in paradise, which is cool too. Always something to do. And the beach is always 20 minutes away wherever you are. So
that is nice.
Right. One other question I had that I haven't really heard you talk about, maybe this is a bad question, but this is for individuals and for their retirement accounts. But is there a way that small and large businesses can also take advantage of paying less in taxes, or kind of getting them in tax deferred or tax free vehicles?
Sure. I mean, you can always, the LIRP doesn't have any income thresholds or contribution limits. So a lot of times business owners will use the LIRP as a sort of a really flexible tool. But you also have access to 401ks with the Roth option. So any business owner really can take advantage of the Roth 401k. This year you can put in, if you're under age 50, you can put in 20,500. If you're over age 50, my business partner is slightly over age 50. So I always rib him a little bit that he can now put in the full 401k contribution, which is 27,000. Whereas I can only put in 20,500. So, and if your spouse works for your company as well, she can put in 27,000 if she's over age 50. So that's $54,000 that you can put into a tax-free account just by, and that's on US soil. So that's that you can put a fair amount of, and on top of that, you can still, if you meet the income thresholds, you can still put money into your Roth IRA. So think about this, Charlie, that, if you have a company, you could put 27,000 for you into a Roth 401k, 27,000 for your spouse. If she also has access to it, that's 54. And then if you're both under the income thresholds, which is 214,000 of modified adjusted gross income per couple, you can put in 7,000 and she can put in 7,000. So 14,000 plus 54,000 is 68,000. That's 68,000 per year that you could put into tax-free accounts if you are under the, the income limitation. So the IRS, I tell people, take advantage of every nook and cranny in the IRS tax code, because there's a lot of things that when you put them all together add up to a lot of tax-free investing.
Awesome. I'm just going to throw in a couple more quotes that I really like from the movie, from the book. You say the 0% tax bracket isn't evil. It's actually encouraging people to pay taxes now at a historically low rate than later at a historically high rate. So you're still paying taxes. You're doing it earlier. And the really interesting thing to me that I didn't know is Ronald Reagan, back in the day when he was pumping out the movies, he was making $200,000 a year, like 100,000 per movie, which was a lot more then. But basically, he wouldn't do more than 2 movies a year just because the bracket he was in was like 94%. So he'd get being paid like 6 cents on the dollar for what he would make after that. So that's kind of the funny thing about taxes, but also what's the highest tax bracket in 2022? Like 40% or something?
37, but in 2026, that goes up to 39.6.
Okay. Yeah, there you go. So very interesting. Another interesting thing is Dave is a great speaker. I mean, he serves actively in the church, so I've got to hear lots of lessons and talks as well, which is really interesting. You served in Italy, right, as a missionary? And
Yep.
so it's always fun to hear him break out in Italian too. But our mutual friend Brady Blaisdell, I had dinner with him on Christmas as a missionary, and I don't remember what we were doing. We were going around talking about someone you admire or something, and he's like, Dave McKnight is the most motivating person ever. He's like, I just feel inspired every time he talks. So you're a good speaker. One thing I've noticed is you're very interactive. You like to engage people, even when it's just one-sided. What are some of the things that you think make you set yourself apart as a speaker?
Well, if somebody were to listen to my typical talk that I give, 90 times a year across the country, there's 2 things that I really, really think that are important that you'll see me do over and over again. The first thing is I don't just get up there and talk. I actually ask a lot of questions. I engage the audience, which a lot of people think you can't really do from the stage, particularly if you're speaking to 250 or 1,000 or 5,000 people. I'll still interact with them. I'll still ask them questions because I want to be able to see if they're tracking with me, and I want them to be able to be engaged, and I want them to be going through a thought process to sort of ask themselves how they feel about a particular topic. That engages them. And then the other thing that I do is I tell a lot of stories. You have to have a lot of stories. If you're just getting up there and talking in really technical jargon, you're just going to lose people. And you've seen it in church, Charlie, where if you're talking to the audience, or you see someone else talking to the audience, if you just start doing what we call exposition, where you just tell everyone how you feel about a scripture, they start to drift off. Whereas, it happened in church on Sunday. This guy, new member, Brother Stoke, he's a pilot. He gets up and he starts telling the story about how he was trying to get from, I can't remember where it was, maybe it was Logan up to Riggs, Idaho, and it was the middle of a snowstorm, and he said a prayer and the skies open. I mean, everybody was just on the edge of their seat. And all of a sudden they went from, a different speaker who maybe was just doing a lot of exposition, and their minds are wandering, till they were immediately engaged, right? Immediately engaged. And we've all seen that happen before in church and with other speakers that we've heard. And so to me, I'm stringing a lot of my talk is basically one story after another in an effort to try to engage them, fire their imagination, and make sure they're tracking along.
Cool. That's awesome. I like the speaking. I like the book, but I really like the movie. I think the documentary was good. What were some things what's the process like of like, was that, I mean, obviously, did you just decide, hey, let's do a film? Because I think documentaries are really interesting. I mean, they're done well, kind of like that one. Like I'm engaged. So what were some things you learned from it? What kind of made you want to do the movie?
Yeah, so I did a little small project with Doug Orchard maybe 15 years ago. He'd made a little video for me, and I'd sort of lost track of Doug. And then all of a sudden, I watched this movie called Fasting that was by Doug, and it was really well done. It talks about the importance of fasting, not just from a religious perspective, but from a physical perspective. He interviewed people within the LDS church. He interviewed people, a lot of different faiths, a lot of different cultures, and fasting seems to be something that's sort of a line of continuity between all of these different people. And I was really, really engaged. And so I called up Doug and I said, hey, what would you ever do something like that for me? But just, about the future of the country, national debt as it relates to future of tax rates. It would be only like 30 minutes, something like that. I didn't want it to be a real huge production. And he sort of said, I'll think about it. And he went and he started talking to people in his ward and people, friends that he respected. He said, I've got this guy that I've known for a while. He wants to do this movie about the national debt as it relates to the future of tax rates, the future of the country, the fiscal trajectory of the nation. And everybody that he talked to said, that is absolutely something that you should do. So he comes back to me and says, Dave, I'll do it with you, but it's not going to be a short. It's going to be it's going to be a long form, which means it's more than an hour. So it ended up being 75 minutes. So, we started off with absolutely no one to interview, not a soul. And that's sort of tough because, you're committing to doing this. You've got a deadline and you don't have anybody that's willing to meet with you and be in your movie. So you sort of start with people that are hungry to be in your movie, and then they refer you to different people. And we talked to, David Walker was actually running for governor of Connecticut, and I was able to engage him on his Facebook page. And I said, I don't know if you ever remembered, I was in Wisconsin. I came to see you speak. I shook your hand. I included you as part of my, my chapter one of my book. He's like, oh yeah. So he invited us up to his house in Connecticut. We filmed him there. He referred us to, I believe, Larry Kotlikoff. Larry Kotlikoff referred us to Alan Arbach as a professor out of Berkeley, and also referred us to former Secretary of State George Shultz. And, Charlie, once you get George Shultz, you can get pretty much anyone. So we were able to, you call somebody up and say, hey, look, we're doing this documentary. George Shultz is in it. David Walker's in it. Larry Kotlikoff's in it. Alan Arbach's in it. And pretty much you've got authority and legitimacy and can pretty much get anybody in. We almost got Joe Biden. We almost got Ben Carson, but barely missed on those two.
Maybe for the sequel.
Yes,
right?
Indeed.
So I've got just a couple more questions, and this is once again kind of for the younger people. So with your career as a whole, I mean, the cool stuff is the book, the speaking, the movie. People see that and they probably think it's cool. But on the other hand, it's just numbers and taxes and money. And so what does your day-to-day kind of look like? And people who are considering financial consulting or whatever that field is, what does it kind of look like, and what you think you need to be good at it, that kind of thing?
What I do day to day is not what the typical financial advisor does day to day. So I can tell you what I do day to day and what a typical financial advisor, particularly one who's just starting out, might do day to day. So what I do day to day is I do a lot of stuff for YouTube because I got a YouTube channel. So I do 2 videos a week. So I got to write the scripts for those. I've got to film those. I've got to edit those, get them off to the editor and get them edited in just the right way. I'm always writing a book. I've got an employee with, 9 or 10 employees. so I've got to supervise all that. I've got 250 advisors across the country who work with me as part of my organization. So running all of that is pretty time intensive. So that's sort of my day to day, but a financial advisor day to day, you've got to find someone to talk to. I mean, it's sort of like being a missionary, right? You wake up every day and you're only as good as how many people you can help, and that the money you can make in this industry is a direct byproduct of the people you can help. So it's going to be a lot of beating the bushes, particularly in those first couple of years, waking up and saying, okay, who do I need to talk to? Who can I get referrals from? How do I find the next client? How do I sort of sharpen the saw and sharpen my skills so that I can bring as much value as I can to people? So that's, 80% of it, financial advisors don't really survive the first 2 years because they hear a lot of no's and it's really battering to their self-concept and they just can't take it anymore. Because, let's face it, how many times have all of us been hit up by financial advisors? It happens all the time. So it's a tough industry, but I'll tell you what, it's a really rewarding industry if you can make it past the first couple of years and really keep your nose to the grindstone and don't worry about all the no's and focus on the yeses and keep putting one foot in front of another.
Yeah, those are pretty basic business principles, right? Like just being able to go after the goal. That's great. Now, to the average 20, 21-year-old return missionary who's going to college or is thinking about what to do, what would you have told your 21-year-old self as far as advice, counsel? What are some things you know now that you wish you knew then?
Well, something my dad told me that was really useful. He says, whatever you end up studying, whatever craft you end up honing, someone has to be willing to pay you money in exchange for that service. And that's, I hate to rip on the person that does the gender studies degree or the underwater basket weaving degree or what have you. But, you got to think about in terms of what service are you going to bring to the world? And is that a service that people are willing to pay you for? And that should inform a lot of your decisions about ultimately what you end up studying. I saw a lot of professional students in my day that just like being students, but ultimately on the back end of it, they weren't any more employable than they were when they started college. So that's just something to think in mind. You got to begin with the end in mind. And remember, at the end of this long educational journey, you have to have some sort of skill that the world is going to be willing to pay you for.
I really like that. One time I heard that capitalism is forced altruism, because what you're talking about is you only get paid for what value you're giving someone. And from your perspective, I think you've done a really good job of, well, you could just do cold calls or could just do Google AdWords, but you've provided content through the book, the movie, your YouTube and social media, where you're providing value to lots of people where you couldn't otherwise. And so you're able to reach them. You wouldn't be able to reach 350,000 people who have the book in any other way. And so being able to provide value in that way, yeah, and just kind of being mindful of, it's that service mentality, right? Even though at the end of the day you're getting paid, it's how can you help them and remove their pain or problem to be able to give them that value.
That's exactly right.
Awesome. Now you mentioned you're always writing a book. I saw something you just posted. Is it called Infinity Code or something? You want to give a little plug for that real quick?
Yeah. I got tired of writing boring business books. So I decided to write a novel that had basically a subtext of a business principle in it. It's sort of written after the Dan Brown Da Vinci Code model. It's a thriller. It's very suspenseful. It's basically about 25 Harvard graduates. No, it's 20 Harvard graduates back in 1985 who form a nefarious cabal that's bent on someday completely reforming the monetary policy of the United States. And they're waiting and biding their time for the day when one of them will rise to the office of the presidency. And once they do, they're going to unleash their plan on the country. And meanwhile, there's a Harvard sophomore named Ian Becker who is basically about to get kicked out of Harvard because he can't pay his tuition, and his grandma dies, and in investigating his grandma's death, he comes across this order and uncovers their plot, and he has to try to stop them before election day, because once election day happens, their plan is going to be unleashed. So that's sort of the story. Dan Code, suspenseful, edge of your seat type stuff, but embedded in the story is a very important financial principle that's very important for our country. And so, it's a book that I hope gains a lot of traction in the same way the Power Zero does, because I'm pretty proud of the story, and I think people are going to like it.
Awesome. I'm excited. That sounds super cool. So kind of as an overview, these are some things I take away, and I hope the listeners do too. Obviously, it's about how to pay less taxes to get in that 0% tax bracket. So whatever position you're in, follow those steps. The book goes over it of how much you can put in, for your savings, how much you can put in the tax deferred, and how much you can maximize with the tax-free bucket. So just pay attention to that, take advantage of that. I mean, we talked about value. I think that's huge. Figure out how to provide value for whatever industry or business you're in. And then it sounds like you've done a good job at scaling it. So be creative, and whether that's content or providing something for them. And the biggest thing that stands out to me about you, Dave, is doing things a little bit differently, where you said, I'm not the typical financial advisor. Well, that's perfect, because that's how you stand out. And you kind of gone the extra mile to be able to provide these tools and content where other places they can't really find it. And so I just heard yesterday, I was listening to this video of Dave Royce, who started our sales company, but as he said, the difference between 100% and 110% is just 10%. So just kind of a little bit of extra effort goes a long way. So Dave, thank you so much. And we really appreciate you taking the time to teach me and teach everyone today. So.
My pleasure. I appreciate you having me.